Domnule ambasador Logsdon, bună ziua, bine ați venit la Europa Liberă.
Bine v-am găsit. Bună ziua.
It's been 2 years since you started your diplomatic mission to Moldova. Did something change in the country during these 2 years? What would be the main change that you see?
My goodness, so much has changed in the last 2 years since I've been here in the Republic of Moldova, and so many positive things have changed. I think 2 years ago, we might have still been talking about a former Soviet republic, poorest country in Europe. Today, we're talking about an EU candidate country on its way to accession.
So we will be talking about this and much more in the studio in our next half an hour.
Great.
Follow me.
Thank you.
Kent Logsdon, the ambassador of the United States to Moldova. When you arrived in Moldova 2 years ago, Russia was about to begin its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it's been 2 years since then, but apparently the invasion did not go like Russia planned in the beginning, but the war is still waging now. And I want to ask, did you expect at that time that this invasion will drag on for so long?
It's so hard to think back and remember exactly what we thought would happen. But as you remember, in those weeks and months leading up to Russia's invasion, it was an unprovoked invasion of a neighboring country, Ukraine. We shared information with countries around the world, but particularly here in Europe, including Moldova, because we saw this coming. We saw Russia's plans, and we wanted countries like Moldova to be aware and to know about it. I think it still was a shock to all of us on the 24th when the further invasion actually happened, but still it was one of those moments where people said, oh my gosh, it's really happening. I think on those days, if you had asked any of us, it would have been hard to imagine that 2 years after that terrible day, we'd still be talking about Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war in Ukraine. So I think it's hard to know what would have happened, but of course we know the history. We know what happened. We know that the brave Ukrainians fought back, that the West came together to support them, and that Moldova and other countries around Ukraine opened their arms to literally millions of refugees who had to leave Ukraine.
Ambassador, how you said Moldova opened its border to the Ukrainian refugees, but it relied on the help of the international donor, including the United States, to help Moldova to manage this wave of refugees and to host hundreds of thousands of them. Is still United States supporting these efforts in Moldova, and how?
We're strongly supporting Moldova's efforts in both managing the refugees. There's still about 100 or 110,000 Ukrainians who are here. We estimate about 1 million refugees came through the Republic of Moldova onto other places seeking safety. It's not the only effect, though. Of course, supply chains were cut, families were cut off from each other, the borders were closed for many products, for many economic ties. So it's been very difficult. We saw the difficult economic effects here, high inflation, high energy costs. All these things came as a result of that war. The United States and our partners around the world have really responded. So since the war started, since Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine began, we have supplied about $774 million to support Moldova across the board in lots of different ways, but about $118 million went directly to support Ukrainian refugees here in Moldova, as well as the communities that are hosting them. The bulk of our assistance goes through the UN family, through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, of course, but all of the different UN agencies that have done an amazing job in first handling the humanitarian needs, the emergency needs of the refugees, in addition to what the Moldovan people did. And then secondly, now working on the integration of these refugees into Moldovan society. When I think back on those days, though, you're right, the international community came to support the government of Moldova, the people of Moldova. But don't forget, those first couple of weeks, it was truly the Moldovan people. I saw them. I went out to Palanca. I saw people driving their cars and saying, who needs a ride? Where do you need to go? How can we help you? And we're talking about women, children, older people, and many, many people with disabilities who were looking to get out of harm's way. And that was truly an amazing moment. So I am glad to say that the international community, including the United States, came to support Moldova, but I don't want to forget that Moldovans did this first by themselves.
Was Moldova itself in a real danger of being invaded during these 2 years of war?
We continue to, of course, watch this closely, and we have no evidence and indication that Moldova is under threat of military attack from Russia. That said, as I mentioned, there were many ways that we've seen the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, has really affected Moldova and hurt Moldova, whether it's economically with the high costs of energy or inflation, whether it's the refugee, the cost of people who've had to leave their homes, or whether it's just the worry of instability that people worried about. We're only the next country from the war. So all those things came together, but we don't see any threat, military threat of action happening here.
Did Moldova in these 2 years do enough to enforce this military and defense capacity? And is the country safer now than in February 2022?
I think people in Moldova and the international community really had to think about what does it mean to support Moldova's political sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and of course its constitutional neutrality. These were all important issues. And I think it is fair to say that a nationwide societal discussion began about what does it mean to be a constitutionally neutral country and how do you defend yourself? So the United States, along with our partners, has really increased our support. We've been a partner with the Moldovan military, for example, for 32 years, since really independence, ups and downs in the relationship, but always focused on helping. About $123 million in support for over the past 30 years. But I can tell you almost $80 million of that support has come in the last 2 years, because even though we've worked very closely with military leaders who wanted to reform, who wanted to change the military, many people, including the current Minister of Defense, studied in the United States, went to war colleges in the US, learned about how a modern military should work. But none of the investments that were needed happened over the past 30 years. So we, the European Union, other countries have been very focused on how can we help with equipment, just for example. The equipment from the 1960s that Moldova was using needed to be updated. So we've been very pleased to be a partner in supporting Moldova as it modernizes its military. It's also important to think about what a military is in the modern sense. And that also means, just as we use our military in the United States, it means that there's a natural disaster. You want the military to be able to help. Refugee crisis. You have to have mobility. You have to have soldiers who can also help. And of course, the other thing we've really seen step up in the last few years is Moldova's interest and support of international peacekeeping operations. So we've seen a military that has international experience. It was in Iraq, but it's also now, we've got the 20th rotation in Kosovo as part of the NATO force there, including the first time 4 women went as part of the deployment, which was great. And we just saw the Moldovan military leave for its 2nd rotation in the UN mission in Lebanon. So those are all really interesting and exciting ways to show that this military is modernizing and thinking about what it needs to be in order to protect Moldova's constitutional neutrality.
Is Moldova's military getting closer to NATO standards?
We would like to see that happen. We see it every day with the commitment of reform, but also the equipment. Those are all the things that have to be done. You know, NATO is and has been a partner of Moldova since 1996. Moldova's been a member of the Partnership for Peace, but we've really seen in the last few years an increase in this tie between NATO and in the focus on taking advantage of what NATO can offer a country like Moldova, a partner country. And in particular, we've seen that in the way that if you think about NATO as a gold standard for military, you want to be able to work with the very best, and you want to be interoperable. You want to make sure that your equipment is also connected to the partners and allies. When we think about the EU aspirations of Moldova, you want to be able to work with your partners, even within the EU. So this isn't a question of membership in NATO. That's a question for every country themselves. So Moldova, at whatever time, would have to make that decision. If they ever did, they would then have to look to NATO and make the request. NATO doesn't go around asking countries or encouraging countries to join. That's a sovereign decision of a country. But instead, this partnership that has been so important for so many years, I think has really ratcheted up because of Russia's terrible war in Ukraine next door, and people realizing that you also need a military in the modern day. You can't just depend on saying we're neutral to protect yourself.
Is transnistrian conflict easier to solve today than 2 years ago?
The Transnistrian conflict, of course, is always an important issue in Moldova. It's a position that we have taken, which is to continue to be supportive of a Moldova that is territorial integrity is respected, its political sovereignty for all of this country, for all of Moldova. That's really most important. We strongly support the OSCE's role here. We like to think that work that they do, and even in the last few years, the 1+1 discussions between Chișinău and Tiraspol are working on issues that affect people every day. We've also seen, though, an incredible increase in the economic ties as more and more people in Transnistrian region have to think about how to get their goods to market. And because of the Russia war in Ukraine, you've got a border that's not open. So people have to look to send their products to the European Union. And that has brought the parts of Moldova together as they have to think about how do we sell to the European Union? How do we meet those European Union standards? And so that has helped, I think, bring the sides closer together in the economic side. And think about the future. Moldova as an EU accession country, an EU candidate country that will someday be part of the EU, I really hope to think that the so-called authorities in Tiraspol are also thinking about this future, because their future will someday be between two EU members, the Republic of Moldova and Ukraine. So I think all of these are different aspects of this problem as we try to move towards finding this peaceful settlement that will be the reintegration of Moldova. And as I said, the support that we've given to make sure this politically sovereign and territorial integrity of Moldova is respected.
Moldova's leaders have been talking a lot about a hybrid war that Russia is waging against Moldova. How would you describe these hybrid threats today?
The hybrid threats are very real. And I think it's something that the government of Moldova, the government of the United States, partner governments around the world, but in particular in the European Union, are really thinking about. All of us are under threat from this kind of battle. And what we've seen here in this hybrid warfare in Moldova is really twofold. One is, of course, it's a battle for the information space. We've seen a huge increase in mal and mis and disinformation that people here are subjected to not know really what the true stories are. And we see that very active Russia behind that. We've also seen here in the Republic of Moldova support from Russia through political forces, through different political proxies. And we saw a lot of that, of course, in the local elections last year. We saw a lot of different parties that were getting foreign money, undeclared money, illegal money in these campaigns. And so that was a great concern. So I think this hybrid war threat has been something we saw lots of evidence of. Oh, I almost forgot the plot last year, of course, in March. That was uncovered that Russia, again, intelligence forces trying to use people to go on the streets and actually destabilize the situation here. So these are all pieces of evidence that we see that happened last year and that we know will continue as this country moves forward and tries to stay on its European path, because there are many forces that do not want to see that happen.
Do you think these threats will increase as we near presidential elections in Moldova and possibly a referendum about the EU accession of the country?
We do assess that these will continue, and these threats will continue, and they will increase as we see many people who are in Moscow, people who are opponents of Moldova's European path, are going to see the continued progress that Moldova is making, and they're going to want to stop it. They're going to want to put out information that stops it. That is something that we've tried to do to work with the government, everything from supporting cyber security to make sure that they're better able to support and manage and protect the systems here, whether it's critical infrastructure or just government systems or even the Central Election Commission, to make sure that they can count the votes right. That those are all really important things. We've also tried to work with the new Disinformation and Communications Center that the presidency has set up. We have signed an agreement last year with the State Department's Global Engagement Center to try to find ways to share information so that this society can be better protected and better able to manage these threats from outside, especially in the information space.
Ambassador, you took part at the consultations, public consultation was organized by President Sandu about over the referendum to become part of the EU. And I want to ask you, what are the main expectations from this referendum, and what might be the risk of holding a referendum like this, for example, this year, or maybe in the same time with the presidential elections? We still don't know.
Yeah, look, the referendum is a decision that a government will make. It's a sovereign decision, not for us to comment or to encourage one way or the other. But we certainly understand what the president and the government's goal is. The president, by consulting with so many different civil society, political, now diplomatic players here, was intended to give us an opportunity to hear what the reasons were for calling for a referendum now, and actually to acknowledge the risks. So the reasons, of course, now is to try very hard to ensure that Moldova stays on its European path, and with the goal of saying that needs to be in the constitution to keep Moldova going forward, regardless of what happens in the future, regardless of outcomes of elections, that the majority of people here in Moldova say, yes, this is what we want. Of course, there are risks, because we know, just like the local elections, there will be opponents, there will be others out there who won't necessarily play by the rules, who will pass a lot of information around to talk about what that means. But I think there's also a feeling that right now is the time to make sure that people have a chance to make their voice heard and say, this is what we want, this is where we want Moldova to go. So again, as any referendum, there's never, in democracies, you can never know exactly what the outcome will be. But in this case, we'll do everything possible we can to support Moldova in its path to the European Union. That's our position, and that's the position we'll continue to take.
Let's remain a little bit and talk about elections. Last summer, the Shore Party was outlawed in Moldova because the party was trying to destabilize the country and advance Russian goals here. And a part of the candidates from this party were prevented from going into elections, local elections in November last year. How do you see those measures taken by past government? Were these measures too harsh or maybe too soft?
I think every government has not just a right, but more a responsibility to ensure that its citizens are able to vote for real candidates of their choice, to have real information about what's happening, to not be given propaganda, country needs to, and a government needs to protect its information space, it needs to protect its electoral space. So overall, we understand why the government took the actions that it did. At the same time, we always encourage governments to make sure they also pay attention to freedom of expression, to the law. Do they follow the laws? Do they follow the rules? And do they tell their people why decisions are being made, why decisions are being taken? And that's the most important part for us. It's not for us to say this was right, this was wrong, but we understand why decisions were made. We want to see, just like people of Moldova would want to see, what were the reasons, what was the rationale, and then were the rules followed and was information passed to the citizens? That's the most important thing.
President Sandu has often said that corruption is one of the most important threats and risks to Moldova's security. Have you seen this risk diminishing over the last 2 years?
I think if you boiled down the last two elections, the two national elections, both for president and for parliament the last few years, you could boil it down to anti-corruption. That people in Moldova wanted to see a government, wanted to see authorities who would take on corruption, who would take on judicial reform. The United States has been proud to be one of the partners in helping push forward this process of judicial reform, in particular through our support for the vetting that has gone on. First, the pre-vetting commission that was set up, but now also the vetting for judges, and now the commission that set up the vetting of prosecutors. So we think that's really important. It has taken longer than all of us would like to see, but success is happening. The pre-vetting commission is about to wrap up its work. We now have a fully vetted, functioning Supreme Council of Magistrates. We see a newly elected Supreme Council of Prosecutors with a new chairman who's also been vetted, making new rules, taking on some of the challenges. And we see a commission that is working on the vetting of judges and a commission working on the vetting of prosecutors, getting through that work, which is going to take some time. So there has been success, there is progress being made, and we're really proud to support it.
Ambassador, you told me that it's taking longer than expected, but are you happy with the speed of the reform in the justice sector, generally speaking?
We know the commitment is there. We see the actions that are being taken, and we are pleased with the progress. So we see it's going faster in some ways than people would expect. In other ways, it's taken longer. Sometimes it's just practical. We've found in the setting up a vetting commission, it's never happened here. So you need to have all the experts to staff a secretariat. You need a lot of translation work to help the international commissioners. I think those are the things that took us more time than we expected in setting up this process. Our hope, though, is that the 2 vetting commissions that are working now will be able to learn a great deal from the experience of the pre-vetting commission over the past year, and they'll be able to move more quickly as they assess the candidates that they'll be looking at vetting for these important jobs, both in the Supreme Council of Justice, the Supreme Council of Prosecutors, the Prosecutor Services, and of course all the colleges that oversee these institutions. It's really important for people here in the Republic of Moldova to have faith and confidence in the judicial system. And though it may be taking a little longer, the goal is still the same, to ensure that there is a place that people say, yes, I can go to the courts and will get a fair hearing.
To have faith that everything it will be fair. So let's talk a little bit about the energy problems in Moldova. So Moldova took some steps to diversify its energy supplies because Russia was trying to pressure the Moldovan government using the energy. But what are the main concerns that need still to be addressed?
Yeah, the energy situation here has been one of the most critical for the Republic of Moldova. If you think of it, just 2 years ago, Moldova was more or less 100% dependent on sources of Russian energy. And before I came to the Republic of Moldova, I worked on energy at the State Department, and I have not, I must say, ever seen a country move so quickly to diversify. So as you know, just 2 years after I arrived, it's only been 2 years, but now we see Moldova with essentially able to say on the right bank, no Gazprom gas is being used here. All of that is now bought and sold, purchased on the international market. That's amazing. That's a great change that's happened. The moving of Moldova and Ukraine to the European energy grid, the ENSOE, the electricity grid, that's really important as well, because again, as we saw last year, for the first time, when there wasn't a contract with the transnistrean region, there was an ability for Moldova to get electricity from the European electricity grid. Now, there are certain reasons, of course, it makes sense. It's still cheaper electricity coming from MGRES, from the Transnistrian region. That's a continuing issue as we go forward. But our goal, as we see that what does Moldova need, we were lucky in the last supplemental from the United States Congress, we were able to obtain an additional $300 million in support for energy diversification and self-reliance here. And so we're looking now to figure out the best way to support Moldova so that you can make that leap forward again on energy self-sufficiency, on energy resilience, that you can control your own fate. One of the areas, of course, was we supported the government with budget support, because we also know the government had to pay additional funds to buy higher priced energy in the past year than they would have if they had been able to keep the old traditional ways. Secondly, we're looking to find ways to help with interconnections to the electricity grid in the European Union, in Romania in particular. That's really important that Moldova is able to tap into that electricity grid. We're also looking to find ways to help the generation here of power. One of the ways is to help with battery storage, for example. And we hope that battery storage will actually lead us into renewables, which is another goal for Moldova's green future, which is very important. And then, of course, we're thinking about different ways we might be able to support power generation, some limited power generation here, with an eye in all of this to also bring in the private sector, to bring in private investment, so that Moldova, in the long run, will have much more say over its own energy future. And again, as we have said in the United States, you never want to be overly dependent on one source of energy. And so this will give, we hope, Moldova a much brighter future as they think about how to put the right energy mix together for the Republic of Moldova.
Ambassador, a recent Radio Free Europe investigation suggests that Moldova companies acted as middlemen in delivering aircraft components to Russia in 2022 and in 2023, despite Western sanctions. How do you evaluate Moldova's compliance with Western sanctions against Russia because of the war in Ukraine?
I think all of us, all the partners with the U.S., the European Union, and others, we've all encouraged Moldova to continue to enforce the sanctions. And we have seen a real effort in Moldova in the last year to align more closely with the European Union sanctions, partly as part of the accession process and partly because it's the right thing to do. We have seen Moldova be incredibly principled and strong in their statements, in their positions when it comes to Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine. They've been very clear from the beginning. President Sandu, whether speaking at the United Nations or to people here, it's been very clear where Moldova stands, and Moldova stands on the side of the Ukrainian people and Ukraine. That's been important. So we have continued to see this commitment to ensure that everything that is possible to stop this Russia's war in Ukraine is happening. So we'll continue to work with Moldova to increasingly encourage the more and more we can to say, how do we keep the sanctions going that ensure Russia does not have materials in order to fight this terrible war?
The U.S. has been one of the biggest supporter of Ukraine's defense against Russia. What will be the level of U.S. involvement in Ukraine and in Moldova during the presidential campaign in the United States and beyond this campaign? Will it increase or stay the same or decrease?
I think, as always, we look to history. And the history of Moldova-U.S. relations, I think it's been now 6 different administrations, 6 different presidents since Moldovan independence. Our commitment to Moldova's future, to the Moldovan people, has never wavered, has never changed. Sometimes our relationships with governments are closer than other times, but we've always been there. We've never walked away from the Republic of Moldova, and that will continue regardless of our election cycles or what's happening domestically. We'll continue, as you've heard, President Biden has made the commitment that we will continue to stand with Ukraine. We'll stand by Ukraine. He has continued to work hard to find ways that the United States can continue to support Ukraine. We know that supporting Ukraine is also a way of supporting Moldova, because Ukraine, in many ways, as I've heard President Sandu say multiple times, Ukraine is fighting for all of us in the West, fighting for our future, fighting for our freedoms, and that's really important that we continue to do that. President Biden has made it clear that he is committed to finding a way to work with Congress to continue supporting Ukraine, including in the military side. And that, as we'll see in the next weeks and months ahead in our Congress, we'll continue to have that debate about how best to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
So, Ambassador, just a few minutes before our interview, the Russian press, the Russian mass media announced that Alexei Navalny, who is a Russian politician from opposite to Vladimir Putin, died in the prison. Can you comment on this announcement?
Sure, it's a tragedy to hear this sad news that happened today. We have said that this imprisonment was unlawful. It was something that was a terrible tragedy that he was there at all, and the fact that he has died has been again just one more bit of bad news. We'll continue to look over the next weeks, I think, for additional information, but regardless, it's a very sad and tragic thing that's happened.
Ambassador, thank you for your time and for this interview.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be at RFE.
Thank you. Acesta este podcastul video pe agenda, cu ediția nouă în fiecare zi de miercuri. Îl puteți găsi pe paginile Europei Libere, pe rețelele noastre de socializare, dar și pe canalul nostru de YouTube, pentru că aici încercăm să găsim răspunsuri la întrebările care contează pentru dumneavoastră.